Hello all, this is Cassie Powers with the National Association of State Energy Officials, NASEO. Thank you for dialing into our webinar today to review emissions tools that states can use in support of developing their beneficiary mitigation plans under a settlement with EPA and VW. We are going to go ahead and get started since it's a couple minutes past the hour to just go through our agenda for the day. We're going to start with a very high-level summary of the settlement, just to make sure that everybody is on the same page. We'll then review a new resource that was developed by NASEO, which is a Beneficiary Mitigation Plan Toolkit. And then we'll dive into the meat of the webinar, which is an overview of the various emissions tools available to states that they can use to calculate NOx reductions from projects in support of their investments. We'll be hearing from Ann Burnman from Argon National Laboratory to review A-Fleet, and Jeff Rockwell from US EPA to review the diesel emissions quantifier, and Armin Tonman with US EPA to review a new tool to help calculate shore power emissions calculations. We're going to pause for questions between each of the presentations, and then we'll also have time at the end for questions. A couple of housekeeping notes. One is we are going to have all of the attendees on mute for the webinar. If you do have questions, you can raise your hand and we can get to that during the Q&A portion of the discussion, or you can send a note to me over chat, and we'll be able to read those off in between presentations and also at the end as well. Also, just a note, we are recording this webinar, so there will be a copy available online following the presentations. And we will also post slides that our panelists use. So to get started, just a really quick overview of the settlement with US EPA and Volkswagen. VW agreed to spend up to $14.7 billion to settle allegations of cheating emissions last year. The settlement funds will be used to buy back and/or modify vehicles and to support national and state-level projects to reduce NOx emissions. These were for vehicles that were in excess of the NOx emissions regulations. And so, as you can see, $10 billion is going to a vehicle buyback and modification program for consumers of the affected vehicles. $2 billion is going into a zero-emission vehicle investment portion that will be administered by Audi, Volkswagen, and their new subsidiary Electrify America. And then $2.7 billion is going into an environmental mitigation trust that can be used by the states, and that's what we're going to focus on. So an overview of the Environmental Mitigation Trust. These funds will be allocated to beneficiaries, which include states, tribes, as well as certain territories based on the number of impacted VW vehicles in their jurisdictions. The trust is going to support projects that reduce NOx emissions where the vehicles were sold and operated. This is a table of just the breakdown of the initial allocation. One thing to note is there is a pending a settlement also in the works for another pot of affected vehicles that will likely add an additional $225 million to this allocation, which will then be divided amongst the potential beneficiaries with the same type of formula used for the initial allocation. Just a quick overview of the timeline that we are looking at for this. Just to note, this timeline as well as all these resources are available on NASEO's website, so you can go back and take a look at it after the webinar. The big thing that we are waiting on right now is the trust effective date. Once the trust is established, then states will have 60 days to submit their certification forms to be designated a beneficiary. And then once the trustee has an opportunity to review the certification forms and approve or deny the beneficiary status, states will then have 90 days from that approval to submit their beneficiary mitigation plan. On the beneficiary mitigation plan, this is a high-level document that beneficiaries will need to develop in order to access their allocated funds. It's designed as a public-facing document which states can use, and it should address the overall goal for the use of the funds, as well as the categories of anticipated eligible mitigation actions the states intend to invest in, as well as a preliminary assessment of the percentages of funds anticipated to be used for each type of action. There should also be a discussion of how the proposed actions will impact air quality in areas that bear a disproportionate share of air pollution burden within its jurisdiction, as well as an expected range of emissions benefits. I do want to reiterate, however, that this is an initial high-level plan. These are estimates, and the types of projects that are identified in the plan can change. And so if states do want to go back and modify their plan after the fact, they are certainly able. Now, in support of states as they're developing their beneficiary mitigation plans, NASEO has developed a beneficiary mitigation plan toolkit. This was released on Monday and is available on NASEO's website. It is designed for state energy offices as well as other state agencies as they are developing their plans. It's a reference for state agencies that provide an overview of the settlement. It will also highlight plan considerations for the beneficiaries. This includes of course, how the various projects will impact reductions in NOx, but projects can also help states to achieve broader goals. So that can include greenhouse gas reduction goals, fuel security and energy assurance, and economic goals, as well as improving health of folks in the communities, as well as improving the air quality in areas that are disproportionately impacted by the communities. That's one thing we do want to stress, is that while all projects that are invested in under the Environmental Mitigation Trust will result in decreased NOx emissions, there is an opportunity for states to also pursue longer-term goals. And some of those goals are explored a little bit in this toolkit. The toolkit also highlights various repower and replacement options, as well as tools states can use to calculate NOx emissions. Some of the alternative fuels that are explored in the toolkit include natural gas, propane, electric, and clean diesel vehicles. There's an overview of the various fuel types, as well as some of the pros and cons of each of the fuels. The toolkit also then provides an overview of a variety of, of some of the emissions tools that states can use. We will explore those emissions tools more during this webinar. The toolkit also summarizes each eligible mitigation action, as well as the ranges of expected NOx reductions that states can expect from investing in various types of projects, and also showcases successful implementation of the technologies. And this report was authored by NASEO, as well as the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, VEIC. I did just want to highlight an example from the toolkit. As I mentioned, the toolkit goes through each of the different eligible mitigation actions and provides kind of the breadth of information that states may want to consider as they are looking at projects that fall within the different actions. This is just highlighting kind of what the toolkit covers. So for the eligible large trucks category, for each action, the toolkit provides a summary of the eligible vehicles. It also provides an illustration of the typical emissions impact of repower and replacement options for eligible vehicles, as well as a summary of the percentage of the project that can be funded through the trust. One thing to note is that the emissions calculations that are included in the toolkit is designed as an illustration that states can use to get an idea of the type of emissions impact that they can expect from investing in various projects. I do encourage states to go in and to play with the different tools to understand which tool works best for them, as well as to supplement the tools with additional information and data. One thing to note is that a number of the tools available, including A-Fleet, DEQ, also the National Ports Assessment that was used heavily in the creation of this kit, does rely on data that is a few years old, and so it is definitely worth taking a look at some of the new resources and information available from the various fuels industries to understand what the latest technology is for various vehicles and fueling categories. You can also talk with your clean cities, and they'll have information on the latest type of technologies and vehicles available, the expected emissions that can be gotten from these newer types of vehicles as well, and that data can be input into these various tools. The toolkit also then provides case studies for each of the eligible mitigation action areas that highlight successful implementation of projects. For example, in this category, we use the city of Milwaukee as an example. They received a $750,000 grant to transition their refuse fleet to CNG a couple years ago. I believe that money was used to help offset the incremental cost to allow them to purchase 21 new CNG vehicles and install 2 CNG stations. One thing that is worth noting is that in the settlement, infrastructure can accompany investment in fleet fleet purchases. That is an overview of the toolkit. I encourage folks to take a look at it. Again, it's available on NASEO's website. It is intended as a reference for the states. Some additional steps for states then may include, and these are things that we've highlighted in the toolkit, but I'll iterate them now also. We're urging states to consider projects that support longer-term goals, including the NOx reductions, but also looking at broader greenhouse gas reduction goals, economic development goals, energy assurance goals, etc. There are really a number of projects that can support these wider goals in addition to just reduction of NOx. States may also want to engage stakeholders to understand what projects are the priorities in their jurisdictions and how projects may impact those communities that are disproportionately affected. States may want to explore various emissions tools and use some resources that are right for their areas. And similarly, they believe they may want to examine industry-specific studies to learn about the most recent emissions impacts of various technologies. A great way to do that, too, is to talk with your Clean Cities Coalition in your area or the representatives from industry to learn about the most recent information on technologies available. That's a summary of the toolkit, but now we get to dive into the meat of the webinar. We are going to hear about a number of various tools that states may use to help calculate reductions in NOx emissions, as well as other emissions that they may want to take into account. So our first speaker, Andy Burnham from Argon, is going to kick us off. I'm going to turn it over to Andy now.
Thank you very much, Cassie. Can you hear me?
I can. Thanks, Andy.
Perfect. So today I'm going to talk about the A-Fleet tool to examine emissions and costs of alternative fuel vehicles. So Argon National Laboratory, where I work, has supported the Department of Energy's Clean Cities program with tool development for more than 15 years, almost 20 years now. I'm going to go through a little bit of a history to kind of say where we are, bring us to where we are today. So the first tool that I worked on was released in 1999, and this was a tool that was co-sponsored by EPA as well as Clean Cities to look at the ozone precursor and carbon monoxide emission credits from alternative fuel vehicles for state implementation plans. Then in 2009, we developed a tool to look at the emission benefits for Recovery Act grant proposals. Later that year, we released a more robust tool called the Green Fleet Footprint Calculator. That tool was developed to estimate petroleum use and greenhouse gas emission footprints of medium and heavy-duty vehicles as well as off-road equipment. This tool supplemented the fueleconomy.gov website, which provided the same results of petroleum use, GHG footprints, but only for light-duty vehicles. There wasn't anything for medium and heavy-duty at that point. So fast forward to 2013, we released the A-Fleet tool to analyze alternative fuel vehicles' costs and benefits and try to look at these issues in a holistic manner. So previously, Green Fleet looked at, as I mentioned, petroleum use, greenhouse gas emissions. What we wanted to do is expand, what people might want to look at. And so we included air pollutant emissions as well as cost of ownership. And we developed the tool in Microsoft Excel as we talked to our stakeholders that oftentimes you're getting information from fleets, or they would, and that they wanted to be able to easily import data and put into Excel. The tool contains 16 fuel and vehicle technologies. Conventional, I'll start with conventional, is gasoline and diesel. So depending on what you're comparing to, we typically compare gasoline light-duty vehicles for other light-duty, and then for heavy-duty we compare diesel. We have hybrids, both gasoline, diesel, and as well as hydraulic hybrids. Plug-in electrics like plug-in hybrids, as well as all-electric, battery electric vehicles. And then we have a number of alternative fuels, including compressed natural gas, liquefied natural gas, LPG or propane, hydrogen, ethanol as E85, and various biodiesel blends such as B20 and B100. The tool can include 7 major vehicle types. So these include passenger cars, passenger trucks, transit buses, refuse trucks, combination long-haul vehicles. Some of those categories are pretty broad. We have data more specific on 23 vocations. So an example is for the passenger car category, you might have a taxi cab, a police vehicle. So we have kind of vehicle miles traveled data, fuel economy, cost of purchasing those vehicles. So you can kind of dig into, real specific fleets. So we have a lot of default information for people, to start with. The A-Fleet tool was recently updated last year. It and its user manual are available on the GREET website, and you can also find links to A-Fleet on the Clean Cities or Department of Energy's alternative fuel database, which is a great website, has lots of resources as well. So getting into what the tool does, it has 3 calculation methods, and it really depends on what your goals are, which calculator within the tool you would use. So the simple payback calculator is used to do somewhat of a quick analysis to look at the annual emissions and the simple payback of purchasing a new alternative fuel vehicle and comparing that to its conventional counterpart, such as gasoline and diesel. This will give a fleet owner or someone who's trying to do an analysis, a rough estimate of, does this fuel vehicle technology make sense for my fleet? Because while we provide a lot of default data, to do an analysis properly, you really need to use specific data to a fleet or to a specific case, because that's how you're going to really understand whether this technology works, because not every technology works in every single case. So this is the point of a tool like this. The next calculator within A-Fleet is the total cost of ownership calculator, and this is used to look at lifetime emissions and net present value of costs over the years of planned ownership of a new vehicle. So basically this is a more detailed cost analysis that you can do for a fleet. It looks at things like depreciation. It looks at different financing options, whether you take a loan or not, and tries to really dig into a little bit more detail, so those who want to kind of take that next step on maybe the economics. What it also does is look at lifetime petroleum use, greenhouse gas emissions, and air pollutant emissions. Where this might be of interest is that while the simple payback calculator kind of estimates, here's your average annual air pollutant emissions, as we know, a vehicle, when it's new, has a certain amount of air pollutant emissions, but as the vehicle ages, those emissions get worse. So in that calculator, you can actually see as the vehicle gets older, the emissions, air pollutant emissions specifically, get worse. Next and last is the Fleet Energy and Emissions Footprint Calculator. And what this does is allows you to look at the annual petroleum use, greenhouse gas emissions, and air pollutant emissions of existing and new vehicles. So this is really the ability to do a footprint of an existing fleet. And so here you can see, within a fleet, where are the emissions coming from? I have, say, 5 garbage trucks, 3 supporting trucks. I can do a comparison and say, okay, depending on, these are a certain age, and I can look at through the calculations here and see, where should I target potential replacement due to some of these environmental factors. Next, I'm going to talk about some of the major data sources that go into the tool. First off is Argon's GREET 2015 model. This is a life cycle analysis tool. And so what we take from GREET is WTW is well to wheel, so it's life cycle petroleum use and greenhouse gas coefficients. So what we're trying to look at is not just emissions of greenhouse gas emissions or petroleum use only from a vehicle. We want to look at emissions and energy use kind of upstream. So then a good example is electric vehicles. So in that case, the electricity is generated at a power plant some miles away, so we need to incorporate those emissions and energy use from there to do a proper comparison. We also take some fuel economy data from GREET, and as well as some of our alternative fuel vehicle, so vehicle-specific emissions data are taken from there. And so GREET is a tool that I work on kind of separate from my Clean Cities work, and it's really looking at the latest research on, some of these key areas along kind of our, you can see in the chart, well to pump and then the pump to wheel. So trying to understand, what are the emissions, what are the energy use impacts of different, stages along a supply chain of a different fuel. Next up is the Clean Cities Alternative Fuel Price Report. And so what we get from that is fuel pricing by state for different alternative fuels. You can't find a better source than this report for that data, and it comes out quarterly. So we're able to, roughly estimate what the prices are today in each state, and it has data both on public refueling stations as well as private fleet stations. So that's an important factor, especially for alternative fuel vehicles. The case of compressed natural gas and propane and some other fuels is that you can actually get much lower prices if you develop your own refueling infrastructure on site. So this data source allows us to look at that. Next is the EPA's MOVES 2014A model. And so what we get from that is gasoline and diesel vehicle operation air pollutant emissions factors by state. And in the next slide, I'm going to kind of get into the specific details, talk about how a fleet generates air pollutant emissions. So we can, kind of talk about NOx and how we do these calculations. So we use MOVES to, again, generate emission factors for gasoline and diesel vehicles. Well, why don't we use MOVES for natural gas or propane or some of these other fuels? MOVES is really focused on gasoline and diesel, as that is the vehicles that are predominantly driven in the United States. So they have a lot more test data, a lot more information on that. So the data on other alternative fuels is not as good. So we have decided we're going to use gasoline and diesel as our baseline. And so what emissions do we get from MOVES? NOx, PM10, PM2.5, VOCs, and CO. What MOVES does is gives in-use emissions. So I think that's an important thing to think about, when we're talking about, the purpose of this money is that we have to really understand what the emissions of vehicles are in use when they're actually on the road. We can get data on certification, and that can tell you, that can tell you a lot. It can tell you kind of, how these vehicles do on certain duty cycles, but it doesn't give you the whole picture. And so MOVES tries to really look at in-use emissions. I think there's continuing research coming out, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of these factors and how they play into alternative fuels, but that's an important factor to remember that this is in-use emissions, trying to understand how these vehicles operate in the real world. So the vehicle types that we get from MOVES for light-duty vehicles, we have passenger cars, passenger trucks, and light commercial trucks. And then for heavy-duty, we have school buses, transit buses, refuse trucks, single-unit trucks, and combination trucks. So single unit are a wide range of vehicles, but you could think like a delivery box truck, or a step van like UPS uses, and a combination truck would be an 18-wheeler that we all see on the roads today. So what we generate from MOVES is both emission factors for old vehicles and new vehicles in the current year. So what this allows us to do is develop that footprint, which I did mention, to examine the benefits of removing old vehicles from the road. So what you'll see in calculators such as A-Fleet and others is that, old dirty diesels are kind of the ones that have the highest emissions. So you can kind of get the biggest bang for your buck is removing, say, pre-2007, pre-2010 diesels from the road, and you can see a lot of emission reduction. So tools like A-Fleet using MOVES data can show you kind of the benefits of that. What we also do is look at deterioration rates of new vehicles. So how we're going to look at for the simple payback calculator is that vehicle again today has a certain amount of emissions, but as it ages, the emissions can get worse. So we can look at that and see how how that compares, and then say compare that to an electric vehicle with a different kind of emissions platform, which I'll discuss in the next slide. So when we go kind of into A-Fleet, what we're using is, and I mentioned this a little bit before, is that we use relative alternative fuel vehicle emission estimates from GREET. So what are the relative emissions of a natural gas truck compared to a diesel truck? So we're looking not really what the emission rate is of a CNG garbage truck. We're looking at test data that says comparable engines have, say, 50% lower NOx or 25% lower VOCs or something like that. So that's, we went and I was part of this project where we recently developed a heavy-duty module for GREET where we examined in-use emissions, and we looked at the current literature, current test data of in-use emissions, and tried to analyze what the kind of technology-specific benefits there are. And so I think one of the things to think about is that this is an area that still there is some interesting testing coming out of, say, California on this, and that we're trying to capture and trying to examine more of, is that in certain in-use applications, they've found that diesel emissions are much higher than they are what the vehicles are certified to. And so again, thinking about the VW situation is that in certification emissions don't always equal what they are in the real world. So in applications, the California studies are showing that in applications where you have low speeds operations, so say like transit buses, garbage trucks, or port operation, the diesel vehicles really don't do well in that. Current diesel vehicles, model year 2015, 16, 17, don't do as well in those applications because they use SCR as a technology, and that technology is really suited for kind of over-the-road trucking where a lot of these vehicles are used. But in cities and in those type of applications, they don't work as well. And so I think there's more and more research coming out there, and we're trying to incorporate that in our tools. And I think MOVES, hopefully, they're incorporating more and more research out as well. So that's something to think about, that the tool can provide us with some, guidance on these things, but there are bigger questions, and there's still research and testing is still evolving. So we need a little more information to kind of help. But I think, some of these things, as Cassie mentioned, you can talk to some of the fuel providers, vehicle manufacturers, and so forth. They're coming out with new vehicles that might meet, tougher standards, and I'll discuss that in a little bit as well. So what we do with those GREET relative emission factors, we basically multiply those times the emission factors from MOVES. And what we do is we want to make sure that we're comparing the correct alternative fuel vehicle with the correct conventional vehicle. So an example is, for propane, you're typically using a spark-ignited engine. Well, gasoline is used in spark-ignited engines, so we compare those emission factors. That's our baseline, basically. And then a simple example, well, for biodiesel, it's a compression ignition fuel. Of course, we use we compare it to diesel, which is also obviously a compression ignition fuel. Currently, we do not include upstream or electricity generation air pollutant emissions. While I did say we do include like the greenhouse gas impacts, we don't include the air pollutant emissions. This was a decision because we're thinking kind of more of a fleet specific case where what are we necessarily kind of the impacts of air pollutants and human health. When we start talking about upstream emissions and electricity generation emissions, those can happen, not just a couple miles away. They can happen in a different state. There's some data out there that says, let's say, more than 90% of the emissions, like kind of the impacts of emissions from electricity, often impact outside of the state that you're using electricity. While on the side of vehicles, while some of those emissions do kind of travel, most of the impacts are going to happen within the state. Say 80% of the impacts are actually going to be inside the state. So it gets into some tricky issues, and I think Cassie has that in the toolkit, and we can talk a little bit more maybe in our discussion about those issues. So kind of talking about what we have and then some of our updates. We're trying to update we're going to update A-Fleet this year, and so some of the things that we're trying to include are the option to examine heavy-duty vehicles with low NOx engines. So I had mentioned this before, that California is using has low NOx standards, so basically 50, 75%, and 90% below the 0.2 grams heavy-duty standard. And so right now there are compressed natural gas or natural gas engines that can meet the lowest standard, 90% lower. So we're incorporating some of that data into A-Fleet for the next release. We're also looking at idling emissions and idle reduction technologies. Moves, when we crack into moves and get into some of the nitty-gritty details, we can get some of that information. So we're working to incorporate that in A-Fleet. And then we are trying to think about how we can include upstream and vehicle production emissions. So it is a tricky area, and it might be just kind of something optional that we'll provide. But that is something that we're thinking about, that we could include something electricity and upstream emissions, because we do get those information through the GREET model. We're going to add new fuels such as renewable diesel, which is becoming popular in California and the West Coast. And then we're working with another national lab, NREL, to develop an online user face. So right now the tool is spreadsheet based. There's benefits of that, but then online user interface has other benefits for user friendliness and being able to walk through and do some like more simple calculations. So in summary, Argon has developed A-Fleet for the Department of Energy Clean Cities program to assist stakeholders and fleet operators nationwide. A-Fleet can help estimate the economic and environmental costs and benefits of alternative fuel vehicles. It can inform new vehicle purchases, and then it can examine the energy and emission footprints of existing vehicles. Default data is provided for pretty much every key input, but using your own data makes your analysis more meaningful. As well as, I kind of went into some of the details about how we do these in-use air pollutant emissions calculations. Our use of moves and Argon's GREET models are the two kind of key sources. I want to thank the Department of Energy, my sponsors, Linda Bluestein, Dennis Smith, and some colleagues at Argon who have made my work possible. I know we're going to go to questions later, and then if we have time, maybe later as well, I can show a quick demo, but I have some backup slides, so I think Cassie's going to share them, and it gets into a tutorial on how to use the tool. So that could be very useful, and you can always contact me if you have further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. That was great. It's come to my attention that the chat feature isn't operational for some folks. If people do have questions, you can email them to me. It is cpowers, CPOWERS @NASEO.org. And I can read those aloud, and I don't see any hands up. Andy, I do have a couple of questions, but I think I'll probably hold those until the end, and we can kind of compare notes and questions across the presenters. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Next, we're going to turn it over to Jeffra at EPA to talk about the diesel emissions quantifier.
Hi, I'm Jessica Rockwell. I work for the Office of Transportation and Air Quality at EPA, and I'm going to be talking about the diesel emission quantifier, which we affectionately call the DEC. So what is the DEC? It's a way to evaluate clean diesel projects and also options for upgrades for medium heavy and heavy duty diesel engines. It was developed as an interactive web-based tool for users that don't have a lot of modeling experience. We're currently working on a new release which will come out in April, and the user interface is changing significantly. So the screenshots I'm going to show you today are from our test box, and some are from staging, some are from the test box. If you go to our website, you won't see these screens for a little while, but hopefully soon. What does the DEC do? Well, it can assess on-road, non-road, locomotive, and marine projects. It accepts user-specific inputs for your engine specifications and also your usage. We do have default values, but as Andy was saying, if you can put in your own specific numbers, it gives you a much better estimate. The DEC also allows for multiple upgrades, such as emission control devices, idle reduction, engine or vehicle replacements, alternative fuels. And the results are shown as annual and lifetime estimates for baseline emissions, for reduced emissions, both in tons and as a percent of the baseline. You can figure cost effectiveness for the total project, or you can just look at the cost of the upgrades themselves. And it also provides PM-related health benefits. That module is a little bit old, but it still can give you some interesting results. What the DEC will not do is it cannot evaluate C3 marine engines. It doesn't address greenhouse gas reductions except for CO2 when you reduce fuel. It does not look at the emissions from power plants. Black carbon emissions, and it can't figure the health benefits from NOx, hydrocarbons, or CO. It also cannot be used for SIPs or conformity. The way it works is there are sort of two different ways depending on what you're doing. If you're doing an engine or vehicle replacement, the DEC generates your baseline emissions, and then it looks at the emissions from your new engine or vehicle, and it subtracts the two, and those are your reductions. If you're doing a different type of an upgrade, such as an emission control or idle reduction, what it does is the DEC generates your baseline emissions, and then it takes the reduction percentage that comes from either the EPA or the California Air Resources Board verification and certification programs. I don't know if you're familiar with those programs, but both EPA and CARB look at different technologies, and they verify that the reductions that the manufacturer is claiming are actually valid. And particularly for our DERA grants, you have to use a verified technology. The assumptions in the DEC are for the alt fuel, CNG, LNG, LPG, and really anything else, we don't really have a good source for that data. And so what we know is that no matter what fuel the engine uses, it has to meet the diesel standards. And so we use the diesel standards as a surrogate for these alt fuels. The only exception is for CO2, and the DEC takes the gallons of alt fuel that you're using, and they convert it to diesel equivalent before it does the calculation for the CO2 reductions. When estimating the lifetime reductions, we use the median life. You can change that if you've got better ideas about how long you think your particular engine is going to last. But we do have a cap, so you can't say your engine's going to last for 100 years and you're going to get reductions for 99 of those years. The other thing is for non-road, locomotive, and marine, the DEC asks that you enter either the baseline engine model year or the tier, or both if you know them. If you don't know both of them, if you only enter one of them, it will assign the other one. So if you enter the engine year, it will assign the tier, and vice versa, which may not be exactly right, but based on what we know, what you've told us, we make our best guess at what that should be. Our data sources for the DEC are as the A fleet model uses the MOVES 2014A, and this is in-use data. It is for on-road only at this point, and we've been able to do a major update to our on-road module using that. For non-road, locomotive, and marine, we use EPA regulatory documents. And for non-road, we also have some factors and formulas that we take from the non-road model. The non-road model has been incorporated into MOVES, but the data itself has not been updated in a long time. So we don't actually use the data from non-road, but we do use some of the factors and some of the formulas that were developed for that. And as Andy alluded to, the regulatory documents state what the emissions should be when the vehicle is new, but we do see deterioration sometimes in these vehicles, and it may not necessarily reflect what's actually in use. And as I mentioned earlier, the emission reductions for the different upgrades come from EPA and CARB verification and certification programs. The strengths of the deck are that it's easy to use. You can save projects that go back and edit them, say, oh, I've got 6 of these, I thought I only had 4, whatever. You can review to make sure that your inputs are exactly the way you want them. And then once you do your run, your inputs and results are both downloadable in an Excel format. So you're able to have a record of that. We have historic baseline data. The on-road begins in 1985. And the non-road locomotive and marine begin in 1973. For MOVES, we've been able to get running emissions, duty cycle idling, and hoteling emissions for on-road vehicles. And also we've been able to get, we also have duty cycle specific factors for line haul locomotives. We were getting some feedback that sometimes line hauls are used as switchers, and so that's one of the options that we now offer in the deck. The limitations our deck is related again to the alt fuels. If you're switching fuels and you're not making a major upgrade in terms of the year of the engine or adding some other upgrades, you're probably not going to see any NOx reductions. We just don't have the factors. We do, however, have factors for B5 and B20. Those came from MOVES, and that's for on-road vehicles only. We don't have an offset for electric vehicle and engine replacements or electrified parking spots for the emissions from the power plants. And our health benefits module is in need of updating. So let me give you just a look at some of the screens. These are the screens from both our test box and our staging servers. So this isn't what you're going to see when you go out there, and they may change a little bit, but basically this is what they're going to be looking like. So the first thing you want to do is create your project, and you identify your project. First of all, it's either on-road or non-road, and for right now, locomotive is included in non-road, or as a marine project. Down here, you can enter the cost of the project, so that would include all your administrative costs, any travel, anything like that you would put in here. You don't necessarily have to break it up by these categories because DEC doesn't care. It just takes the total and figures that out. So first we're going to look at on-road, non-road, or locomotive. We want to add our vehicle or engine group, and usually a group is a group of vehicles or engines that are pretty much similar. They are probably the same engine model year. They may have the same usage characteristics. You can group together things that are less similar, but your results will be less specific. So if you want a good estimate, you should really try to limit the size of, not the size of your group, but the characteristics in your group. So for on-road, we have these categories that come from MOVES, the same as A Fleet has. For non-road, we have these sectors, and when you go into those sectors, you will get different equipment types that you can select. And for locomotive, we have line haul, passenger, and switch locomotives. So here's what the on-road would look like. If we select from the previous screen on-road, long-haul combination, that will be auto-filled here. In some cases, the class will be auto-filled. You can put in the quantity, the engine model year, your upgrade year, what type of fuel you're using. And then these are your usage, this is your usage input screen. Over here, It's for your fuel usage, your miles traveled, and for on-road, particularly only actually for long-haul combination, we've got idling hours and hoteling hours. So again, we have defaults for these. If you have specific information for all of the fields, you can just put them in. If you have specific information for only some of the fields, put in the defaults first and then edit those. If you put in your numbers first and then add the defaults are going to override everything. And then down here is where you get the estimated remaining life based on the age of your vehicle and the expected, not the expected life, sorry, the median life of the vehicle. So now we want to define this for non-road and locomotive. So you get a target, for non-road you would select a target fleet or a sector. So here I've selected ports and airports. You get this drop down, which I cut off to fit on the screen, of a variety of different types of equipment that would fall under that category. And if you look behind the red box a little bit, you can see for non-road and locomotive, the deck also requests the engine model year and or the tier, the upgrade year, the fuel type. This is an example of the locomotive. I've selected line haul, and the duty cycle can be either light haul or switch. Now you're ready to add the upgrade once you've defined your base group. And the categories are idle control strategy, emission control, vehicle or engine replacement, fuel options, aerodynamics, or tire technologies. Not all of these categories are available for every group type, but this is sort of all of them. So that's why I selected this page. So if we want to add an upgrade for an on-road vehicle, here's our engine replacement. We put in the new model year and the estimated number of gallons that we expect to be reduced. When you do that, you can fill in here your capital costs for the upgrade itself and the labor to install it. And then this will fill based on what you've selected in terms of, in this case, it will be the replacement model year. In this case, we've got an idle control strategy. So you would enter the number of idling hours you expect to reduce and the number of hoteling hours, where idling is just, you know, like you're at a dock getting loaded or something. Hoteling is where it's an overnight or, you know, for rest purposes. And again, you would have, your numbers would fill in based on that. For non-road and locomotive, very similar, except it's going to ask for your new model year and tier, and also your horsepower. If you're doing an engine or vehicle replacement, if you're doing another type of emission control device, it's going to look pretty much the same as the on-road did. Wanted to show you the marine because that is a little bit different. When you do marine, each vessel has to have its own deck run. You get to select the type of vessel, and once you select your vessel, you can add engine groups. You can add propulsion engine group, or you can add auxiliary engine group, or you can add both. When you define your engine group, this one is defined as propulsion. You put in your model year again, your year tier, and your upgrade year, and the horsepower. For marine, you also need the cylinder displacement. So once we've got everything set up and we're ready to run, we hit the calculate button, and these are the results that we see. They come out in annual results and lifetime results. They're for NOx, PM, hydrocarbon, CO, and CO2. And if you're doing something with a fuel reduction, you'll see that over here. You get the baseline for the upgraded vehicles, the amount reduced after the upgrade, and the percent reduced, both for the annual and lifetime. In this case, my remaining life was 2 years, and you can see that the lifetime results are exactly twice what the annual results are. The bottom half of this screen is going to tell you what the cost effectiveness is. In this case, I only entered costs for the capital costs. I didn't enter that total project cost on the first page. And this is, if the pages were together, you would see this is NOx, PM, hydrocarbon, CO, and CO2. So give you your reductions. You've got a summary here that tells you how you described your fleet and what the remaining life is. And I just want to point out that for many of these fields, you can go in if you've got better information, not only for the defaults, but even for the reductions. One of the things that you can select is an other emission control device. If you have something that we don't have here and you're able to get, say, from the manufacturer, what the expected reductions are, you can enter those into the fields. Many of the fields are editable. Then we go to the health benefits tab of the results screen. You can enter the state, you can enter the county, you can enter different states if you want, and if you pick a different state, you'll get a different county list. You can allocate your expected reductions between the counties. They have to total to 100, of course. And then you get this, which shows what your expected PM reductions are in each county and what that monetized amount would be. So that's basically a walk through the deck. This is the URL where you will find the deck. If you go there right now, you'll see different interface screens. But hopefully in the next week or two, you will see the ones I showed you. And then we also have a helpline where you can send your questions about DEC or about the DERA option in the VW settlement. And this is the email address and the phone number. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffra. That was excellent. We did receive a couple of questions, and Jeffra, this one is for you. So one, are the vehicle lives stipulated on the deck? So can you see what the assumed lifetime of the vehicle is?
Yes, there's a chart that will, let me see if I've got a page that has the, as you go through, see these blue question marks? This isn't the one I want to show you, but here, this blue question mark, if you click on that, or any of the question marks, you'll get additional information about this particular screen. And this pops up and it has a chart for the median lives and the maximum lives that are accepted for on-road, non-road, locomotive, and marine.
Great. Excellent, thank you. Another question for you too is, a comment came in that setting alternative fuels to equal diesel is an automatic discounting of the alt fuel vehicle emissions benefits. For example, a natural gas almost aero engine has NOx that is almost up to 90% less than the federal certification for diesel. Can you comment on that for the deck?
Yeah, we just have not been able to find a good source to provide that information. If you have that information, as I mentioned, most of these fields are editable, and you can enter that information in. Let me see if I can see where that would go. Yes, it would go in here. If you would have a different, say, engine replacement. I mean, for those alternative fuels, you have to do an engine replacement, and you can enter those numbers in here.
Excellent, thank you. All right. Another question, and this is both for Andy and Jeffra. So given that the data analysis that NREL and Argon have been doing for the last 5 or 7 years, Andy, would you say that ANL has confidence in emissions factors for alt fuels?
So we did a report, I think it was released 2015, on heavy-duty vehicles to understand a lot of things, but specifically really dig into air pollutant emissions. And I think, as Jeffra mentioned, we kind of had that same approach that, hey, if you guys meet the same standards, or if this vehicle and alt fuel vehicle and this diesel vehicle meet the same standards, that's kind of our baseline assumption that the emissions are going to be the same. We tried to dig in to see where we could get really good data, in use, and try to, say some comparisons. I think for natural gas, you're seeing more testing to actually look and see if there are potential benefits. UC Riverside just came out with a good report on the ultra low NOx, engine that's coming out. It's available in California. So I think there is things coming out, specifically to the last 5-6 years. I think you know, it is still a tough area. That's, I think, why, you know, EPA and you know, doesn't provide a lot of that information, because the information is very limited. So I think it's a tough area that, you know, we tried to handle as best as we can. I think the right answer is, you know, we need more testing to really understand in-use implications of not just alt fuels, but of diesel. You know, I think that's why we're here, and you know that you know, the emissions that go through certification aren't always going to be what's in the real world, and so we need, you know, sometimes we need more testing data to actually, you know, understand these implications.
Thanks. And Jeff, building off of that same type of question, what is the process for EPA in adopting emissions factors for alt fuels into MOVES and DEQ? You kind of touched on this earlier, but
into MOVES. My understanding is that the next version of MOVES is going to be looking a little more closely at CNG. They're thinking that they have some sources for that. I don't know about other alt fuels, and it probably will be a year or two before that's available. I'm not in the test group, so I can't really address, you know, what they're doing about getting better information. You know, we've been searching around, and it just doesn't seem to be out there.
Gotcha. Thanks. Another question. We'll introduce a couple more, and then we'll move on to our presentation. But Jeff, one more question. With the upgrade to DEQ, will the already saved projects in DEQ still be accessible?
Yes. Wait, the already saved, yes. In fact, that's been a real focus, is as we change, for example, the categories, we're working really hard to preserve those legacy fleets that are saved in DEC, so that when they're called up, they're going to fall into the new categories or whatever. That's just sort of one example, but yes, they should be there.
Great, thanks. And Andy, one more question for you. When is the next upgrade for A Fleet due out?
It should be out in the next about 2 months.
Great. All right, thank you. We do have a couple more questions, but in the interest of time, we are going to move on. So thank you both for answering those. We'll have some time at the end to return to some questions and the discussion. So moving on to Armin, I'm going to change this over to you so we'll be able to see your screen.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Kathy. So my name is Armin Tanman. I'm in the Office of Transportation and Air Quality in EPA. And I work in the Technology Assessment Center, and we aid Jeffrey's group actually in identifying technologies and verifying them. As some of you may know, part of DERA, or DERA only accepts and can only give grants to technologies that are verified or certified through EPA or the California Air Resources Board. I'm one of the engineers who verify technologies, and we've verified aerodynamics, engines, all kinds of things. And the last several years, we've been getting requests from people, especially states, about verifying shore power. Can they use shore power as in the DERA program? And shore power is one of the Volkswagen options as well. So we decided to do an assessment of shore power around the United States. And we did a report that is going to be released by the end of this week. And I can run through some of the findings of the report. And the best part of the report is the second part of the report contains a calculator that you can calculate the emission savings from using shore power, depending on where you are. So the shore power report that we did, basically, we did this work to understand shore power applications and the commonality of the systems that have been installed, and to have a means to consistently quantify the emission reductions of shore power, which will address a verification path for our DERA program. You know, when we get requests for proposals, we're getting numbers all over the place, and we wanted to have everyone, just like we have for the DEC, have everyone use the same assumptions and standards and emission factors. The report consists of two parts. The first part, the report looked at the characteristics and the benefits of shore power systems around the United States. our contractor contacted each port and around the United States to see what they had, what kind of shore power they had. The second part of the report includes a new methodology, new in that we didn't just look at shore power emissions when a ship turns off or when a ship is at dock, but also when it connects to shore power, what the emissions are from the electric grid. And I'll show you a little bit later how we did that. In general, the shore power report found that the shore power could be highly effective at reducing NOx, PM, and CO2 emissions and associated impacts on the air quality, human health, and the environment. But despite these potential reductions, the use of shore power, of course, has its challenges. In some cases, it was when they looked at cost-benefit analysis, it was very expensive. Depending on the cost of the fuel versus the availability of electricity, depending on where you are in the country, the cost of the electricity varies significantly, and the substantial infrastructure investment for it to build the equipment at the berth is very high, as well as investment equipment on the vessel itself. The report found that the largest benefit come at terminals and ports with a high fraction of frequent callers, meaning cruise ships which frequent the port continuously and using a lot larger amount of power. Usually cruise ship terminals and container terminals. Another thing the report quickly found out is that there are standards already. There's high voltage standards and the lower voltage standards. The high voltage standards, some may not know, only just ratified recently in the last couple of years. But the report found that all the terminals that are using shore power met those emission standards, or I'm sorry, the ISO standards. It was done by the International Standards Organization, the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission, and the IEE, which is the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. It is basically a worldwide standards organization. And it was very difficult because we were involved in about 10 years ago starting this standard. It was difficult because the electricity all over the world is different, and the currents, the different ships use different voltages. So basically, they came up with two standards: a low voltage standard. It's actually a free standard right now, but the high voltage is the standards were ratified. The lower voltage only came out last year, and the ports that we found that were using lower voltage did not meet it because it was such a new standard. The high voltage standards, as I mentioned, are used by cruise, container, refrigerated vessels, and the lower voltage was used by fishing and tugboats. I want to show you a map of the existing shore power locations that the report found. It's 16 locations. There's about 10 high voltage ports, which is in the green dots all around the United States. As you can see, it's pretty much East Coast and West Coast. And the low voltage ports locations are in blue dots. And the size of the dot actually is the amount of energy that port consumes, that the voltage of it. So as you can see, there's Juneau actually was one of the first ones back in 2001. It was used by, I think, Princess Cruise. And there's a funny story with that, because when they first started looking at to assess the capability of using shore power in the city of Juneau, which that was almost 16 years ago, that when they calculated the amount that the cruise ship would need, it was almost as much as the entire city of Juneau. So they couldn't easily tie it in very quickly. They needed all of the infrastructure to develop to be able to, and the transmissions, electric lines to be able to do it. And I think at that time, Princess Cruise, this again 16 years ago, over $5 million on it, as well as equipping each of their vessels at about $500,000 each. And you can see that the cruise, there's a lot of cruise terminals that are using basically the ones you see on there, that is primarily due to the California at-berth regulations. There's 6 locations in California that are required to use shore power at their terminals. And the lower capacity was basically fishing and tugboat vessels that are plugging into Seattle, Boston, New Bedford, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and the Los Angeles, Long Beach area. The paper looked at the costs associated with developing it, but they're very difficult and to gather all that information, because all electricity rates vary and the costs vary greatly. There was not much on it. But as I mentioned, the paper's going to be out by the end of the week, so you guys can take a look at it. The second part of the report looked at a methodology to assess the emissions from using shore power, and basically we needed some kind of a consistent method for estimating potential shore power emissions. And this calculator uses vessel inputs, the activity, and the shore power inputs, meaning from the electric grid. And the recommended approach, this calculator used EPA and California emission factors, and also the formulas in deducing the calculator. So the vessel inputs, of course, was the you have to know the vessel's engines, what the load factors are of those engines, and the emission factors. And these are there are default numbers in the calculator. And the activity inputs include, how many times per year the vessel comes, and telling how many hours it spends at the port. And then the shore power inputs was the more difficult part, looking at where the electricity is coming from. The paper primarily uses eGrid, that's EPA's emissions calculations for shore powers all around the United States. And eGrid is updated very infrequently, once every several years. Luckily, in the last few weeks, there was a recent update, and we've incorporated that into the calculator. And it looks at electricity generation by facilities, and you can look at facilities in general, in a general area, like maybe South Carolina or a state, or even an electric region, or even down to if your port just happens to have a power plant that you can hook up to, you can also use those numbers, and those numbers are in the calculator as well. After this presentation, I'll go over to use the calculator. It's just show some of the screens. As I mentioned, the general model uses, just to compare, it looks at the different eGrid regions. You could pick, I made some examples here. You could look at the Northeast, Alaska, Florida, and California. And the eGrid regions are all over the United States. So depending on what engine you use, I made hypothetical power engine sizes here, but like a passenger cruise with a certain amount of engine, and I made it for those type of engines for each area for Northeast Alaska. And all the blue is inputs, which user has to know the specifications of the vessel. And what you get out is basically the vessel power emissions and the shore power emissions. It subtracts the difference, and you get a difference in metric tons. And there's also a percentage difference as well. So you could actually move this a little bit. You can see in the Northeast, it calculates for NOx, SOx, and CO2. And one caveat about this calculator is that it does not do PM and CO, because there is no PM and CO emission factors in eGrid currently. They're working on it, but it can be derived, and the paper goes into how you can derive PM and factors. But I think most of us, especially for this Volkswagen thing, are interested in NOx values, so this calculator is perfect for that. As you can see, electricity in the Northeast, I think about half of it is from coal power plants. So as you can see, it's NOx is reduced in the 97 percentile range, but there's actually an increase in SOx. So there, a port has to be, or an area has to be careful, because there are trade-offs sometimes depending on what the fuel mix is for the grid. And in the Northeast, you can see there's actually an exceedance of emissions of SOx, but reduction in NOx and CO2. In Alaska, it's reductions all across the board. And I just wanted to point, I also put Florida and California on here. California, you can see very high reductions, and that's because of their high use of alternative fuels for their power plants. And there are no trade-offs in California, and hence that's why I assume they did the regulations. This calculator, this is a general model. You can look at a general area, but the calculator has a second part, the user input part, which down here. A user input, and a person can actually specify a certain power plant, and then specify either the same inputs in blue, and they'll get emissions or emission results depending on what vessel you put and what area power plant. Yeah, there's about 8,500 electric generation facilities around the United States. You could pick any one of those 8,500 or a combination of them if you wanted to, if you knew where their power was coming from. So at this point, if no one has questions about the report, I can show you. I'm sorry. The report is going to be on our website, and it will be on our. It's a long way to do it, but it's maybe just go into the Ports Initiative. It'll be on the Ports Initiative website. And if they have questions, you feel free to contact me at my email or our Tech Center web box. So I wanted to show you how to use the calculator down here. So we did the calculator is part of the paper, and on our website it will be a downloadable spreadsheet, and it'll come out just like this. And as you can see, when you click on this first eGrid region, you can select whatever region of the country you're in, including a user entry. User entry defaults to inputs that you can submit yourself, this line over here. And these are the eGrid regions around the United States. You could pick any one of those regions, and these are the 2014 emission factors for them, and you'll get emission differences for these areas. Back to the example, if you do not want to use a region, and if you know your electricity is coming from a specific power plant, you can leave this blank, and you can pick, just like you can pick a certain facility. And I think this might be I think this is a solar facility, so of course you won't get any emissions for that. You can pick on the vessel, you can pick the type of vessel you have, a carrier, a container ship, passenger ship, and we have all types of vessels here. And then you could also specify the fuel, of course, in the 200-mile vicinity of the shore. You have to use 0.1%. And if you know what your engine sizes are, you can put it in there. And the load factor, while it's at berth, you can put it in here. We use 1 as a default, and the number of vessel calls, the average hours spent at the vessel. So this gets you basically annual hours, annual emissions. And then we included transmission losses also, because I think the average transmission losses is between 5 and 0.05, 0.06. So we even put transmission losses in there, and that by all these vessel inputs, you get an annual energy consumption. You take that energy and multiply by the emission factors to get these emission emission results in annual emission runs in metric tons. And because we put a solar facility, there's nothing here. So the shore power emissions are basically zero. And when you go to here, it's zero also because we haven't specified the vessel yet. Specify a vessel back here. And that's what I did for this, for these top two rows. And it gets, if you look over here, it gets a percent differences for, say, this is an example in Charleston, South Carolina. You get about 98% in the Charleston area. You get a 98% reduction in NOx, 19% in SOx, 40% in CO2, and there's no PM and CO numbers, of course. But within South Carolina, they're close to the Port of Charleston. There's I think, a facility, power plant facility. If you were tying into that, you get a little bit better SOx reductions because that facility, I think, burns natural gas, and you can see the emission reductions are much lower for SOx emissions. And you can go to user entry and put your own emission factors in there, and you can get more specific numbers if you know exactly what your emissions are from your power plant or a combination of emissions. So I think that's about it. If anyone has, I guess we could open up for questions for everyone. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Armin, for that great overview and the demonstration of the tool, and we're excited to see the report and more information available when it comes out later this week. I do have a question about shore power calculations. It looks like from your maps that there was a lot of information and that the tool is really applicable to ports on the coasts. Is this also applicable to ports on rivers and Great Lakes?
Yes, it is, because there's a user entry mode model, and basically you could pick, basically as long as you know what your vessel is. Again, this calculator only does it per vessel, while it's being connected to shore power, and it calculates the differences between the engine emissions and the electricity emissions. So we have all the electric power generation. We have a general model which gives you a general area, depending on the egret area. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
So let me put this up. See, the map basically shows you all the different. You could do it by state too, if you wanted to. So the only thing is about the Mississippi area. As you can see, there's a lot of coal power plants. What this map shows you is the fuel types at each generation facility in a certain area. And you know, you may not want to put a shore power in the Mississippi area because there's going to be trade-offs, significant trade-offs. But it depends. As I mentioned, there's also a user entry mode. If you know you can get the power from an alternative energy source, and that user entry mode, the egret has 8,500 generation facilities, and if that facility happens to be a natural gas or wind or solar, and you're fortunate enough to be close to there, and they provide electricity, then it might be a good choice. So this calculator basically tells you if it's worth it to invest in it or not.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so we have had a few more questions come in. We've got about 10 minutes left. If folks have additional questions, please send them to my email, cpowers@naseo.org, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. One of the questions for Andy and Jeffra has to do with upstream calculations for electricity generation. It's our understanding that A-Fleet and the deck don't include upstream emissions, and that could give kind of an unfair advantage when calculating emissions from electric vehicles, because while the tailpipe is clean, the upstream should be taken into account. Can you guys comment on that?
This is Andy. I'll take a stab at that. Yeah, I agree. I think in the toolkit that NASEO came up with. They used eGrid to come up with some state-level emission factors. So like that, you can come up with some numbers and get to roughly where you want to be. I mean, there's issues with that related, but I'll leave it there. But I think that is something we're trying to add. I think it's something we want to incorporate. It gets more complicated just because where emissions occurred. I think where we're trying to talk about, and something I didn't talk too much about what AFLE does, but we try to go to human health impacts similar to what the deck has, uses some factors on the cost of a ton of NOx or cost of PM on human health. So we try to do that, but when emissions are in different places, the human health benefits, it's need a more rigorous analysis. And so I think I mentioned that before, that electric vehicle emissions, probably 90% of them are going to be outside of wherever you are, like that they're going to impact someone else basically. And then in that case for a vehicle, it might be only 20% of the emissions kind of go outside of the state. So it gets trickier. So, but yeah, it definitely should think about that and how to analyze that. And I think hopefully in the next AFLE version, you'll have some, calculations to help you there.
And this is Jeffra, and I agree with what Andy said. I did point out that that's one of the limitations of the deck, is that we just have not incorporated that information yet. And it's probably not going to happen in the short term, but it may be something that we're able to do in the longer term.
Thanks. Yep, and for the states on the phone, as Andy had mentioned, in the toolkit developed by NASEO, we do use eGrid to try to show some of the emissions impact or some of the upstream emissions impacts for investment in electric vehicles. I would encourage states to take a look at eGrid when diving into their calculations. All right, going into a couple, yes?
I should point out to everyone that eGrid just got updated 2 weeks ago, so they should look at the 2014 version 2 eGrid numbers.
Great, thank you. Wonderful. All right, and I saw that Mike Winka had his hand raised earlier. Mike, I don't actually think I can unmute you, but I see that you did send in a question online, so I will ask that. Armin, can you combine this port power model with the emissions model to get you to a wheels to wire evaluation?
You mean for beyond shore power? Is that what the question is? This is a very specific tool only for shore power, and I think the question might be beyond.
Might be
beyond shore power, and then I think that's what Andy and Jeff are looking at. But they don't have eGrid currently, and it's, as Andy pointed out, it's very complicated. So there's a lot of assumptions in there. What we try to do is, we try to use assumptions from California. We basically we don't want to get new assumptions. We're using assumptions from our regulations that are developed by EPA and CARB, and we want to be consistent with those.
Gotcha. All right, thanks. Another broader question for the group is that emissions and avoided emissions are important, but another important measure is energy saved. Can you use CO2 as a surrogate for energy efficiency, and is there a tool that compares the energy usage of various alternatives?
So this is Andy. So what is in A-Fleet is petroleum use. So as Department of Energy, one of its key focuses was on petroleum displacement. So we calculate petroleum use, greenhouse gas emissions, and air pollutant emissions, the ones some I mentioned before. So you can look at specifically petroleum use. If you wanted to go to kind of an energy, broader energy analysis, the GREET model, which A-Fleet uses a lot of a lot of the data is from GREET. You could look at that. Also, I failed to mention the previous question is GREET has the ability to look at air pollutant emissions. So you could look at kind of maybe the wells, I forgot how he said, the well to wire, the wire to wheel, excuse me, wire to wheels, or looking at kind of life cycle electricity emissions. So GREET is a great model. It has a better user interface. There used to be only a spreadsheet, which was even, it was pretty difficult to navigate if you weren't used to it. But there is a nice user interface that you can also use. So I think that's another option to look at. Look at that.
Great. And Andy, another question on the GREET model. Does it take into account the line losses?
Yeah, so there's a distribution, there's a factor in GREET on the assumed, transmission losses. So Armand mentioned a number. I think it's something in the same ballpark that GREET has. I could double check it, but yeah, that is in there. I'm not sure if Cassie dropped off or if anyone can hear me. Jeffra, can you hear me?
I'm sorry, this is Cassie. I realize I've been on mute as I was doing our wrap up. But thank you all for logging in. And I was just saying that if folks do have questions, you can feel free to email them to me, and I can share them with our panelists after the fact. We'll also be posting the presentations and the webinar recording online. Andy and Jeffra and Armin, thank you for providing those excellent overviews of the various tools available, and we'll follow up afterwards with additional questions. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.